Glorifying grace. John Wesley believed, yes, we are saved by grace through faith. But for him, the reason we are saved by grace is because God is saving us for something. John Wesley believed that we are saved by grace so as to become involved with God's redemptive and saving activity in the world, witnessing and working within the mission of God to advance the complete coming of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, as agents of social transformation. For John Wesley, personal faith must translate into social ministry. In his famous words, the gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. Christianity is essentially a social religion, and to turn it into a solitary religion is to destroy it. You see, salvation is personal, but never private. It always has a social dimension. When we respond positively by faith to the grace of God, we find that during prevenient grace, God comes and finds us as we live in our pits. He calls out to us, making us aware of our broken situation, and he offers a hand of salvation to us, even when we didn't know we needed to be saved. During justifying grace, after pulling us out of our pits, God embraces us in our dirty state, seeing us as being clean even when we are not. He sees us for who we could be and should be. And then during sanctifying grace, God calls us to walk with him so that he can clean us and teach us to become clean like him, to become holy like God is holy, not just to overcome the power of sin, but to become more Christ-like in our lives. When we respond to those three aspects of grace, yes, it has a very personal dimension to our salvation, but that's not the full story of salvation. The inherent purpose and goal of God's loving, forgiving, restoring, empowering and transforming activity in our personal lives is not simply that as saved individuals we can go to heaven when we die. God's purpose in saving you and me is the renewal and salvation of the world God so utterly loves. God's goal is the redemption of all creation. God changes us so that we can participate in God's declared mission of changing the world. Complete salvation always includes participation in God's redemptive work for the world. That is what glorifying grace is all about. Remember Jesus' visit to the synagogue in Luke 4, verse 18 to 19, where unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it is written, and then Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of God's favor." You see, we have to remember that when we are rescued from our own pits, when we are pulled out of our own pits, when we are then taught to be made clean, you see, Jesus wants us to then walk with him, to go then find others who are living in their pits, walking to try and help them, to then pull them out of those pits that they've been living in. And once they are out, Jesus then wants us to go one step further, and he wants us to then try and fill in those pits, the pits that people have been stuck in for so long. He wants us to fill in those pits so that no one else will ever be harmed by that same pit again. See, God has a dream for us, and how we can be part of bringing freedom from sin to his world. As Martin Luther As Martin Luther King Jr. said over and over again, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Befriend the victims of systematic injustice. Side with them. Listen to their stories. Let their pain break your heart. Join the movements to end injustice. Tithe your money to the cause and commit yourself to the struggle. To think that God's love, God's forgiveness, God's willingness to sanctify us into who God created us to be, just for our own personal gain, with no thought of hearing Jesus' words when he said to his disciples, to us, his church, when he said, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Go and set the world free from broken relationships, from sinful systems, from poor ways of living that prevent people from knowing their God and Father who loves them." Well, in Christians' terms, this is not real salvation. This is a cheap gospel that unfortunately has become so pervasive in our society. Real Christian salvation needs us to respond in faith to the personal gifts of grace in the form of prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying grace. But it also needs us to respond in faith to the gift of glorifying grace, which includes taking on the responsibility to enter into God's social love for the world. Authentic salvation causes saved people to passionately desire to be part of God's purpose and activity in the world, because the God we want to walk with is at work in our world. Our God is loving the lost, freeing the oppressed, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, protecting the vulnerable, and ministering to the young and old. As St. James wrote, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. A person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. As we hear those words of St. James, we need to remember, we cannot be saved apart from our deeds and actions. Creed and conduct can never be separated from the other. Our beliefs and behavior are intimately bound. May 2020 be a year where we once again commit ourselves to having little moments of encountering God's grace. Let us recommit ourselves to responding in faith to God's grace by allowing ourselves to be saved so that we may help save others as we walk side by side with God. Amen, and may you be blessed.